Hey guys, welcome. It's Levon here from Amorphoto and L.R.Media on Instagram. Today I just want to do a quick video and initial impressions of the Canon R7. I had the chance to pick this camera up a couple of weeks ago, and I got the chance to shoot with it 3 days after on the weekend. And just want to give some thoughts about my reasons for buying it and whether it suits you. Now, I'll say that I'm primarily a portrait photographer and I'm looking to get into weddings and events. So my thoughts on this camera might be different to yours. Now, when I first looked up and started researching this camera, I found that there was a lot of reviews specific to bird photography, and I think I maybe found one review talking about portraits and shooting people. So I just wanted to give a bit of a different perspective. So if you're the sort of person that's looking at this camera and shoots primarily people, is this going to do what you need it to do? Okay. So first up, some pros, why I got the camera. Well, the first thing is price. Here in Australia, I was able to pick this camera up. I'm not sure if they're trying to clear stock at the moment, but for $1,600 Australian dollars, and that is a real bargain. Now, when I started looking around at new cameras to buy, obviously I was looking at the R5, the R6, the first model. I know the R6 Mark II has just come out, but all those cameras here in Australia are $3,000 and up, okay? So to pick up a camera that has dual card slots, also has the latest autofocusing system, so this has got the dual pixel autofocus 2 system. I believe the same system that's in the R3, although the sensor is different, so you're going to get slightly reduced performance. The dual card slots and a large sensor size, so this is 32.5 megapixels. That just seemed like an amazing deal for me. Okay. Now, my other camera that I have been shooting with for the past 4 years is the Canon EOS R, which I'm filming on right now. Now, that is a fantastic camera, and if you go to my Instagram, l.r.media, all the photos, bar maybe the first 5 that you see, will have been with the EOS R, and the colors out of that sensor are just amazing, and I still absolutely love that camera. It does have some serious drawbacks though, the primarily being the one card slot. I have shot a wedding on the EOS R with one card slot, but it was quite stressful and I don't recommend it. Okay, so looking at getting back into doing event and wedding photography, I definitely needed a camera that had 2 card slots. And when I saw the EOS R7, the fact that it had the updated dual pixel autofocus 2 and it had 2 card slots and it had that large sensor size, I thought this might be the camera for me. Now, I of course was concerned about the crop sensor. Now, my first camera was a crop sensor camera, Canon, and the last crop sensor camera I used was a second body, a 50D, many years ago when I shot a wedding, and I had it just as a backup, and that camera was terrible. The noise performance on it was terrible, the autofocus on it was terrible, everything about that camera was terrible, relatively to the time, okay? Now, that of course concerned me, and I looked at many different reviews and ISO tests to see whether that would be an issue. Now, I've got to say, after shooting with this camera, and I'll put some examples up on the screen, ISO is not a problem. This has got as good ISO performance, if not slightly better, than my EOS R. Okay, so I can shoot up to, personally, 1600 is no problem at all. The files look great. 3200 is fine. 6400, they start to fall apart. I would rather not push to 6400, but if you can, using the noise reduction that we've got now, no problem. You could probably even go higher, but for my tastes, what I like, 3200 is about the max, and that's where I really need to be for myself if I'm shooting people with low f-stop, high aperture, maximum aperture, like 1.4 lenses, I really need to be able to get to 3200 comfortably. And I can do that with this camera, and I've had absolutely no problems. In fact, with the shoot that I did, and I can include some video of that now, with the shoot that I did, I actually accidentally put the camera on auto ISO for a short period. And when I realized that, I was really freaked out. Now the maximum ISO I had it set to for auto was 6400, so I thought I might be okay. But when I came back and looked at the files, the ones that were up to 3200 were fine. The 6400s, for my taste, I mean, they were usable, definitely usable, but I preferred not to share those photos. But you could run them through the latest noise reduction software, and I'm sure that would bring those back. But the up to 3200, no problem at all. Shooting available light, even slightly under or overexposed, perfectly fine. Okay, so dynamic range. That's another one I was wondering about. It is a little bit less than I've noticed in the R. Now, I was shooting some higher ISOs, so I wasn't shooting with a strobe. It's going to be interesting. I'm going to have a chance to test that out soon on another shoot I'm doing, where it's going to be indoors and it's all going to be using flashes. Okay, so shooting that will be totally at ISO 100, and it'll be interesting to test and compare the dynamic range there. But realistically, I found it perfectly acceptable. I never looked at a photo and thought, oh, that's terrible. I can't bring those shadows back. I can't bring those highlights down. Like with any camera, you've got to know its limitations. You've got to shoot with it for a while and then figure out for yourself where your comfort zone is in there. I've never shot a Sony. I've never shot one of those cameras that has that ginormous dynamic range. For me, myself personally, I prefer the Canon colors, and I realize that Canon is a little bit on the back foot in terms of dynamic range, but for me, the colors and the way that the image is rendered is more important. Okay, so let's talk about color. Now, one thing I really love with the EOS R is just the colors that come out of the camera. They're just fantastic. They just really are. Especially if you run it through Canon's DPP software, the colors are just amazing. Now, when I first got this camera, I thought maybe the colors were a little bit lacking, but after taking some time and processing them, maybe you need to use a tiny bit more saturation, but the core base of the colors is most definitely there. And I was, in a very short period of time, able to get to a point where I was happy with how the files looked, and yeah, they looked like my images. So that's what I need out of a camera. I need to be able to get the files to look the way I want them to look. And of course, it depends on your skill level. I'm comfortable with shooting with Canon cameras. I've recently made the switch back to Lightroom, just for ease of workflow and speed. And so that's also added to that conundrum of trying to get those results that I'm used to. I can't really get the exact same colors as I do out of DPP, but DPP is such a slow software that I made the decision that I had to move away from it if I was going to do this in any sort of a commercial sense, because it's such a time suck. It is insane. Even with a fast machine, it's just a very slow software, even though the results out of it are glorious. Okay, so the cons. So one of the other pros that I was looking for personally, and this might not be so important for other people, is after shooting the R and shooting that 30.1 megapixel sensor, I found that quite useful. Now, I'm not saying that I crop in, or take a horizontal shot and make it vertical, but I always like that flexibility of having a larger file that I can crop down if I need to, and that I'm not losing anything. I always like to have a file that I can downsize slightly when I'm exporting it. And with this 32.5 megapixel sensor in the R, I find that I've got that as well. Okay, so that was important for me. If you're shooting events or anything like that, I always find that it's better to include a little bit more in the frame, because you can always crop in. Of course, now with Photoshop and generative fill, I guess that eliminates some of that, because you can fill out in the frame a bit. But for me, myself, I'd rather always have a little bit extra, maybe just a little 5% on the sides and around the frame, so I can crop in. And this camera, again, it fits that brief. Okay, so just finishing up, for me, I'll just show the camera again. For me, it's got everything I want. Now, some people are saying that it doesn't have that third dial on the back here, the scroll wheel. Now, I had a 5D Mark III. I shot that for 5 years. I absolutely loved that camera. And when I went to the R, the thing that I really hated about the R was just the lack of dials and being able to customize those dials and buttons. It is really the weakness of the R, even though the R is a great camera. When I went to this, it was like coming home again. It was really strange because I'd forgotten how nice it is to be able to customize the buttons, have them do what I want them to do, and have enough dials to do everything. Now, I've set up dual back button focus on this camera, and that is the way I'm going to be going forward shooting, unless I'm shooting controlled portraiture with the R with lighting, because it's just such a better system. I really like the scroll wheel and the joystick here. Some people say that they don't like it. I find that it fits right under the thumb. Some people have said that the wheel isn't clicky enough or it moves too quickly. For me, it's perfect. I've had absolutely no problems with it. I'm used to having one down here off the 5D Mark III, but to be honest, it's great. It would be better if Canon would just stick to a layout rather than changing. They seem to be changing with every camera at the moment. The old classic Canon layout, which I think is on the R6 and the R6 Mark II, which is similar to the 5D Mark III, with the classic wheel and the joystick here, is a winner in my opinion. And you know, I understand this is an APS-C camera. I find having two dials that you can do aperture, and I can set the button to ISO speed, and that's fine. I can easily change that, is fine for me. But I realize that some people just really like those 3 different dials that they can adjust anything on the fly with. You can also, if you want, if you have an RF lens, assign that to the scrolly dially thing, which I hated on my RF lens when I had it. Or you can get the adapter with it. It doesn't work quite as good because you're in here. But you can do that. But I've personally have found that I've got more buttons and dials than I need. So I'm happy with that. So personally, the layout for me is not a problem. These buttons here can be a tiny bit uncomfortable to get to, but you know, when I shot, I had absolutely no problems changing settings and adjusting things on the fly after having only had the camera for 3 days, which personally I was really impressed with. So I'll put some of the photos up here. Now these are just out of Lightroom, and I'm still learning to process these files, but I'm happy with the results. And going forward, if I'm shooting weddings or events, I'm going to be using the R7. And if I'm shooting controlled portraiture using lighting, I'm going to be using the Canon EOS R. The main reason for that is just the autofocus system. So talking about the autofocus system, let me just say that dual pixel autofocus 2 is insane. It's definitely a game changer. When I got the R and the introduction of eye autofocus, it really changed the game for me. I can't go back. I realized once I did that there's no way I could ever go back to shooting like a 5D Mark IV or something like that. Mirrored cameras are dead. They're just dead. They just really are. Unless you're shooting a film camera, it's so much better. It's so nice to be able to focus on your composition and what's going on in your frame, and not worrying about where your autofocus point is. Because if you're shooting portrait, it's going to be on the eye. Now, if you're shooting something else, architecture and that sort of thing, you've got the selection of different button types. You've got spot, then a box, and all these different customizable boxes, which is great. So you can set that up however you want to use it. But for me, myself, 90% of the time, I'm either shooting eye detect autofocus, or I'm shooting the spot, which I have set up on the dual back button focus. Okay, so one for eye autofocus and one for spot autofocus. And shooting that on the shoot that I did, I'm saying shoot a lot, aren't I? Worked perfectly. There was only maybe a couple of times that I had to use the spot autofocus, but when I needed to use it, dual back button focus, it's right there underneath your finger, easy to access, and bam, you're on it. Okay. Rest of the time, back button focus, eye detect, bam, you're on it. I had some questions about whether, with the R, the one criticism I have is that it gets a bit spotty if you're in troubling light, or there's your subject has the sun behind them, and it's that sort of classic hard. Even SLRs, my 5D Mark III would find it struggle in that sort of situation. With the R7, I didn't find that was a problem. I'll put up a shot now where I shot the model. The sun was right behind the model. In this situation, the R would really struggle. It really would. And the R7 nailed every shot. I mean, I went through when I was culling and I was checking autofocus, and to be perfectly honest, I just stopped after about the 30th photo that I checked and it was in focus. I just stopped checking the eye to see if it was in focus. They're all in focus. They just all were, which is crazy. It's just crazy. Now, if the subject's further than 10 feet away from you, or you're using a wider lens, it might then struggle. It might just lock onto the head or the body. But I mean, I'm getting, I don't think I'm getting like a 98% hit rate, and I'm not shooting sports or anything like that, but still, that's crazy. So it is definitely a step up over dual pixel autofocus 1. Now, I can't speak for the R6 and the dual pixel autofocus systems that are in that, but I can say for this, it is chef's kiss every time. It's perfect, and for shooting people, that's something that I really need. I need to be able to trust the camera, and with the R, maybe 80-85% of the time it's on. In controlled situations, it's on 100% of the time. But when you're shooting outside portraits and stuff, sometimes you get into those situations where the light can be a little bit challenging. If the light starts to drop, that's also can be a problem, contrasty situations. But yeah, the dual pixel autofocus 2 is amazing, and I'm so glad that I bought this camera. So is this camera right for you? I have no idea. Okay, now I have a full frame camera, so that's a question you need to ask yourself. Does the aperture, does the lens choice and the aperture choice affect you? That's something you got to answer for yourself. For me, myself, I've got a lot of primes, so that wasn't as much of a concern for me. But for you and your lens selection and what you want to upgrade to in the future, that's something that you have to decide. For me, at the moment, this camera is a great choice, and I look forward to shooting it for at least a couple of years, probably more. Okay, I'm not getting rid of my EOS R. I'm keeping that, and at some point I'll upgrade probably to another full frame camera body. But is this shootable for professional results? 100%. It's my opinion. Now, I'm not a professional photographer at the moment making a full-time income off photography. If you are, then you might want to go for something like the R6 Mark II or the R3. If you've got the money and the income to justify that. But for a camera that just offers unbelievable value and unbelievable features for the price, this is hands down the best camera I've ever owned. As much as I love the R, it was too much money for what it was at the time. I just think it is, and I've continued to use it, so it's proven to be a good investment. But just the features in this camera are just unbelievable. Last thing I want to touch on is video. Now, I don't shoot much video. I'm shooting the video on the EOS R now, and I'm just using the basic 1080p, which is what I've used on the R because of the crop factor with the 4K. Now, I did test out just quickly the video on the R7, and I'll put a clip of that in now. It's just my cat, and I just wanted to test the Canon log and then grade it, which is something that I haven't really done before. It took me a little time to work out the LUTs and download the right LUT and do that. I wish Canon would make it a little bit simpler to find their LUTs because they are free, and I'd love to put a little clip in here on how to find them, but it'd take me another 30 minutes to go in and find them again. But if you put a shooting Canon log and put a LUT on it, in the 4K fine, it's so sharp. In this clip, I don't think I added any sharpening at all. There's no sharpening on it. It's just straight out of the camera. Then shot in Canon log, and then I've just put the LUT on it, and that was it. And yeah, it's very sharp. So I look forward to trying to integrate some more video shooting as I learn the camera. The IBIS and that sort of thing, I can't really talk on too much. I tested it with a couple of different lenses. Some lenses it worked better with, some it was a bit wibbly wobbly. The best results I had was using it with a stabilized lens. So I've got the 17 to 35, sorry, f4 Canon L lens, and it worked amazingly with that. But that lens on its own is also very stable. So I'm not really sure with the IBIS. With shooting photography at longer lengths, I did find that it helped. That's the one thing when I was shooting with the R with longer focal lengths, it can get a little bit shaky in the viewfinder, and I think the IBIS will definitely help with that. Okay. Now, lens selections for this camera, I'm currently shooting the Sigma 35 1.4, which is on my Canon EOS R right now, and that gives an equivalent of about 55 millimeters, and that's sort of my standard shoot 90% of things with lens, and I found that to be fantastic on this camera. It's even a bit more advantageous because you don't get so much vignetting as you do on the full frame with the Sigma 35 1.4 Art, which is the one thing that I don't like about the lens. I also have the Sigma 50mm 1.4 Art, and that is just killer on any camera. Also killer on this, gives about an 80mm equivalent focal length, and I'm finding that I'm loving that as well. I also have the Canon 85mm 1.8, and that is also glorious on this. I think it's about a 130 millimeters, and I'm actually really loving that combination. That sort of slightly over 100 millimeters. I don't like anything over 150. I just find it looks squashed. That's my personal opinion, and you have to stand a million miles away. So I'm liking that. Now, the only downside to this camera is on the wide end. Okay, that's where you're really going to struggle. So for me, I'm looking at getting the Sigma 18 to 35 millimeter f1.8 to cover the wider end of the spectrum, and for something that's a little bit faster than the 17 to 35 f4. If you've got a 17 to 35 f2.8, that might be enough for you. It really depends on how much background blur and that you need. I've found it to be perfectly acceptable with all the lenses I've got shooting wide open. I've found that I'm not like, oh no, I can't get any background blur. If you shoot on a full frame camera, of course you're going to get more. It's just the physics of light. It's the way it is. But I haven't found that to be a problem. I think the images look gorgeous. The sensor looks great. And if you're shooting below f2, even on a crop sensor body, you're going to get a lot of that bokeh and that background blur. So to me, it's not really been an issue, and if I really desperately want to, I'd go to the R. Now, if you're a portrait only shooter, you're not going to shoot events, you're only going to shoot weddings, you want the most blur you can get, then you might want to look at the R8 or even an RP or an R. If autofocus if you're shooting in a controlled situation and you just want that full frame sensor, then maybe go for that. If you're shooting anything that's moving, now one thing I want to just touch on here is the frame rate. The R is 8 frames per second. I've only ever shot it in one shot. I just found it to be more accurate, and it just fit my workflow. Shooting this camera, I'm going to be shooting more in available light, and I've really switched over to continuous autofocus. I have no concerns about it locking on and nailing focus. It's not an issue for me anymore. So I'll be switching over to continuous on the R7, which also goes into the dual back button focus and needing that set up because that's much more advantageous, I think, to shooting events and weddings and that sort of thing. So I find that the 15 frames per second is fine. It's enough. I think I had I can't remember which, it was a 40D or something, but it had like an 11 frames per second. And I always found that was about perfect. Like, it was fast enough. I can't remember what the 5D was, Mark III, but as long as it's around 10 frames per second, that's fast enough for me. 15 frames per second is more than fast enough. And if you really want to do something where you're doing a high-speed get the models to spin around or something like that, you do have the option of going to the 30 frames per second. I did try it out. It did fill up the buffer. It was a bit of a bummer because I had to wait for the buffer to clear. I did after that turn it straight back to the mechanical shutter. And by the way, I am shooting mechanical shutter on this, not electronic first curtain, not full electronic. But you do have the option of going to that. If you're doing some sort of a specialized shot, okay, I'm not shooting birds, I'm not shooting sports, but 15 frames per second for me, with the cards I'm using, I don't fill up the buffer. I'm shooting C-RAW. I switched over to shooting C-RAW a couple of years ago. I'm not going back. It's just easier to manage file sizes, and I'm not experiencing any issues shooting C-RAW 15 frames per second. I've just got standard, I think they're 170 megabytes a second cards, and I'm having no problems at all. So that's just my initial impressions of the camera, and I hope that helps if you're looking to shoot the EOS R7. Let me get it out again. There it is. I don't have a lens on it at the moment because I've only got one lens adapter and it's on the R right now as I'm shooting. Looking into getting another one, maybe a drop-in ND filter one, something like that. But yeah, I'm super happy. If you're planning on shooting people, I think you'll be happy too. It really depends on your lens selection. But yeah, I just wanted to give my impressions as someone that shoots people, not wildlife. I'm sure there are literally 20 really good wildlife reviews on this camera, but I really struggled to find just a general purpose shooting people, events, weddings sort of a thing. I think Taylor Jackson had a good video on shooting weddings with it, but that was really the only one I could find. So I hope that helped. Look, guys, if you want to check out some of my work, I'm on Instagram at l.r.media, and of course you can follow me on the channel. I'm going to start trying to upload some more content, and catch you on the next one.